大家好，欢迎来到 BIBF 学习院。本期的主题呢是叫 The Power of Storytelling。我们会讨论中国元素如何打动海外出版人。我们有机会聆听英美的资深专家带来破局秘诀。那么讲故事是国际传播最佳方式。如何在文化背景不一样的地球村里，用最吸引读者的形式来阐释中国特色？那么首先了解国际读者是第一步。本期的 BIBF 学院，我们邀请到3位国际资深的出版策划人和版权专家，为大家诠释如何打造高质量的原创 IP， 了解国际出版的商业运作模式，定标全球消费市场。我是刘小爽 Alicia Liu， 我是英国伦敦辛格文化传播公司的 CEO。我们为众多国际文化品牌策划全方位的国际推广策略，其中包括 BIBF 北京国际图书博览会、伦敦书展以及乐高集团和阿谢特童书集团等。今天加入我对话的几位嘉宾分别来自世界各地，来自美国、法国加纳，还有英国苏格兰，而我本人在英国伦敦。感谢 BIBF 的学习院，让我们有机会在线上可以聚集一堂，与国内的朋友有机会相互交流。那首先为大家介绍一下我们的嘉宾 Jan Ziff 和 Alan Davidson。Hi Jan Alan。
你好，
你好，
好。那这2位呢是 Hackety 教育科技公司的联合 CEO， 他们也是小米视频儿童内容全球首推项目的国际制作人。那 Jan 本人呢，在英国、美国和欧洲儿童内容行业都有近30年的经验。他曾经担任英国 BBC 广播世界新闻驻美国和中东的主持人和制片人，家族6代均为出版媒体人。那今年也就是2020年，Jan 和小米合作录制了跟 Jan Ziff 学英语系列视频，成为小米视频儿童频道的全球首推国际项目。那这2位呢，共同创立的这个 Hackety 公司，他们致力呢用新颖的科技手段，让孩子们读到生动有趣的故事，提高他们的英语水平。他们最近呢，还与中国的出版机构，比如说中少社合作，推出了《老鼠新娘》等精彩丰富的英文的绘本电子视频故事。另外一位嘉宾呢是 Andrew Sharp。Hi Andy。
Hi there。
那安迪呢是英国夏普版权咨询公司的创始人和总监。作为从事版权行业25年的国际版权专家呢，安迪曾在英国的阿谢特童书集团担任全球版权总监，并且亲手打造了风靡全球的儿童畅销小说《寻龙高手》，英文叫《How to Train Your Dragon》。那这本书呢，目前已经有40多种语言出版，而且被美国梦工厂改编上国际荧幕。安迪被英国书商杂志 The Bookseller 评为2019年最佳版权专业人士。那他曾领导专业版权团队呢，在2018年成就800多匹国际版权交易，与1400多家出版商合作，并成功发行了51种语言，近300万本图书。所以呢，现在我将把语言切换成英文，更好的跟我们国际嘉宾来一起沟通。Hi everyone. So thank you for coming to the BIBF Insights webinar and listening to for my first introduction in Chinese. I want to start the discussions today. Our topics on the power of storytelling. I want to start by, really for many readers, no matter where they come from, the childhood experience begins with the line, "Once upon a time." And the stories really teach us, they influence how we view the world from a very young age. This is critical to development and creating empathy for others. So first of all, I want to start with where I come from. My grandfather first translated Charles Dickens' David Copperfield into Chinese when he lived in Shanghai in the 1930s. It was the golden age of Shanghai, known as the Orient of Paris, the dreamlike city where East meets West and the old meets the new. For me, it's one of the few places that could bridge China and the West and where new ideas are born. And today, the children's book market in China is at its golden age. In 2019, 1 in 3 books sold in China was a children's title. The market experiencing 18% year-on-year growth. And there's also a huge diversity of the children's content, ranging from homegrown Chinese original titles to international titles, where we've seen the US and UK are topping the important children's rights, followed by France, Japan, and Germany. We've also seen a rising number of international collaborations between Chinese authors, translators, and international illustrators. For example, we've seen Chinese children's author Cao Wenxuan. He's working with Brazilian illustrator Roger Meller on picture book Feather. And last year, the US Pan Macmillan published one of his picture books, which is commissioning a UK-based Chinese illustrator Yu Long called The Summer. So in the West, I think the latest trends for edutainment content today is also to reflect on the wonderful diversity of our population. And this would help more children to see themselves in the book they read and help children understand the world and their place in it. So I thought to start with, I want to ask all of you if you could share with us some of your insights of your experience and your encounter with China. Should we ask Jen? Would you like to start with?
Well, for me, storytelling began many years ago when I was a little girl. My mother is a very well-known storyteller in the UK, and she honed her craft on us, her three kids. And whenever we went for a long walk, she would tell us a story, and every time the story had the same protagonist, but the story was different. Today, even today, when we go for a walk in the countryside, we tell each other stories based on those characters. It's great all these years later. But she was a musical storyteller, and she taught classical music, listening to classical music to children through the power of stories. And we are a family of storytellers. In fact, I'm sixth generation storyteller. So storytelling has been very important to us in all different ways of our lives. Coming to China, it was just divine because we discovered that the power of storytelling and the tradition of oral storytelling is very strong in China. Many of the old traditional ancient Chinese fairy stories have been handed down from grandmother to grandchild and grandchild to the next generation. It's incredible, actually. It's so long-lived. When you have 5,000 years of culture, you've got lots of stories. And so we have found learning about China, learning about the beautiful stories, the extraordinary calligraphy and illustrations that go with these stories, which are also part of Chinese tradition. In fact, of course, China invented the things we use for writing stories. You invented paper, you invented ink and calligraphy. And so it's only natural that we somehow bring this full circle and find ourselves back in Beijing, a city we love dearly, and talking about storytelling, which is actually where it all began.
Great. Yes.
I think we both found that visiting China, the interest in learning and discovering the amount of effort that parents invest in children and their desire to educate them and open the ways and open possibilities for them and take the time to make that possible. Their desire to sit and read to children. It's striking when you go into a bookshop in China. It's always one thing that you find, and that is that in the children's section, parents are sitting with kids and reading, or kids are in a corner and they're reading books. And then the bookshops encourage that. And it's very unusual. You don't see that in other countries. And I think that's a great tribute to the parents and the desire for education and books, which create a world and open a world to children, as you said earlier, Alicia, is really important in that context.
Right. And Andy, what about yourself? I mean, professionally, you work a lot with Chinese publishers. When was your first encounter with China?
Uh, my first encounter with Chinese publishers would have been about 20 years ago, I guess, when I was selling rights to Chinese publishers. And it's interesting to see, because at that point there were not so many deals. There was some interest in our books, but there wasn't that much sort of transfer of rights from the UK to China. And it was very interesting to watch how that sort of gathered momentum. And then by the time I went to the first children's book fair in Shanghai, it was not peaking, but suddenly rapidly expanding, and we were having a lot more conversations with many more Chinese publishers by that point. Um, and certainly going to China, that was the first and only time, unfortunately, that I've been. And I spent the book fair in Shanghai and then did visit Beijing to go and see some friends afterwards. And it was really fascinating, a good eye-opener to get just a small amount of insight into Chinese culture. And of course, the trade and licensing since then has just carried on growing, which has been very interesting to see.
Yeah, hugely. So, with both of your kind of very international experience, where do you see is the kind of interesting key, perhaps entry point for Chinese stories, for a global audience? Is there any specific elements or genres? For example, I think Jan and you mentioned all the wonderful traditional culture value, and Andy, you talk about the contemporary, that the society fascinates you. What do you think would be the key entry point?
Well, we've been working closely with CCPPG, working through their children's catalogue and taking many of the traditional stories and adapting them for English, so that we can bring that magical touch of Chinese culture and almost mystical feeling that comes with it, and bring that to kids who speak English. But we've done them in a way so that they can also be used by Chinese kids learning English, and therefore reading stories in English that they're already familiar with. But we say that we are adapting these stories and not translating them because, well, for two reasons. One, we couldn't translate them. We don't speak Chinese well enough. And two, the stories are sometimes culturally different. The story, for example, of The Mouse Bride, which is a very popular folk tale all across Asia. It's not just in China. Japan has it, Korea has it, it's in Vietnam, it's in Cambodia, it's in Laos. But in that story, the end of the story is that the cat eats the mouse. And we decided that for Western kids, that perhaps it would be a little kinder to their parents when they're reading it as a bedtime story, if indeed the cat did not kill the mouse, but in fact the parents had to find a different husband for the Mouse Bride. So we have adapted certain little things like that. But we like the traditional stories because they are very Chinese. And it gives us an opportunity to bring stories that don't have something terribly familiar to Western children. And I think there's one important thing, Alicia, to bear in mind when we're talking about the East and the West. To the Western mind, China is a monolithic country. It's a huge country. It's the biggest population in the world. And Westerners tend to see China as one large country, where, of course, when you're in China, the first thing you become aware of, or one of the first things, is how diverse it is, how there are so many different peoples, there are different minorities, that people look different, people speak differently, they have a regional accent. Some people speak Cantonese in the south, they speak Mandarin in the north. Although there's the unifying language of Mandarin, there are still lots of other languages and accents and dialects that are not readily understood by people who only speak Mandarin. Then when you look at the West, The West is not one great amorphous mass either. I mean, the United States is huge, but Alabama is very different from, say, a country in Europe like Liechtenstein. They are vastly different. They speak different languages. They have different cultures, different ages. The East Europe and the Central European peoples are all the way to the north, like the UK, Finland, etc. These countries are old. They have rich cultures, long traditions. Head over to the United States, it's 200 years old. I mean, when George Washington was born, we were still dealing with the Qing dynasty. So it's China goes back a very, very, very long way. America doesn't. It's very hard to look at the West and say it's all one thing, because it isn't. So bringing traditional stories is probably a good way to start, so that there is something that differentiates the Chinese stories from the Grimm stories from Europe, or the Finnish stories, for example.
I think it's a good point too. It's often not recognized by people in China, from what we've seen, just how different people are in the different countries in the West. It isn't just the West. The legal systems are different, the customs are different, the expectations are dramatically different. The way business is done, even the way language is spoken and things are explained. You really do have an expression in English written by a famous person between America and England saying two countries divided by a common language. So they have the same language, but they use it and they mean different things sometimes by the same words. And this brings back why it's important to adapt things from Chinese for Western cultures, for English or whatever. You can't just translate. If you do that, well, we all know that some words in English, when you translate them into Chinese, yes, they're translated, but they don't mean the same. And that's what one has to appreciate with these wonderful stories from China, that you have to transmit the spirit and the traditions behind them when you tell the story to Westerners, so they understand the full richness of the imagery, the pictures, and the stories, and what was created. And that's what we want to focus on, what we do focus on. How can we help our partners to bring those stories through? And I think through that, eventually, what you achieve is you achieve better understanding between peoples, because you're teaching kids at a very young age, and everybody's ideas all over the world, no matter what culture they come from, a lot of the ideas and the way they see the world when they grow up comes from what they learn as children. You mentioned that earlier, Alicia, and we feel very strongly that you're right. So it's important to make people realize that they have so much in common, that people everywhere are similar.
Yeah, everything Jen and Alan you said, I couldn't agree more in terms of, actually when you think about Chinese content adapt to the global audience, actually the global audience very diverse in its own right. So it's almost like we've seen some success in terms of, I guess, Chinese story, and then they married with an international illustrator, for example, and sometimes like what you were doing is even to restructure it a little bit more, how the story is told, so that it fits that kind of, the ending fits the kind of certain children in certain cultural expectations, for example. I think that also brings on to, I guess, the kind of a very much one, in terms of the artistic side, the challenge, and the other side is really the commercial challenge of working with, I guess, multinational publishing groups and international sales and distributions and rights, the legal side. So I wonder, Andy, if you could kind of explain to us a little bit more, because I recall when you were the head of the global rights for Hachette Children's Group, that you had a team of that in 2018, you secured over 800 deals, and that's a huge number, across over 1,000 publishers in over 50 languages. How does it work? How does a typical global publishing corporation work?
They work in different ways, is the first answer. They're fairly diverse, but I think there's a a basic structure that lots of them follow, which would be that they have a sort of parent company who will either be based in Europe or in the US. So for Simon & Schuster, for example, you've got Viacom, who are in New York. And then for the Penguin Random House Group, for example, you've got Bertelsmann, who are in Germany. And obviously Hachette is headquartered in Paris. So that's sort of the ownership, if you like, and where all of the then individual sort of subsidiary companies that do the actual publishing report into that parent company. So I was at Hachette, based in London, responsible for selling the rights for all of the children's publishing that came from the Hachette group, but only the UK. So I had no responsibility over what was happening in France or what was being published from the US or Australia or France or Spain. And indeed, Hachette had subsidiary companies, or still has subsidiary companies in those countries, as well as in India, in Ireland, in New Zealand, in Russia. They also have a joint venture in China and another joint venture in Lebanon. And similarly, Penguin Random House has even more subsidiary companies than Hachette, has them in Brazil, in Canada, South Africa, so all over the place. And different groups are centered in different places, obviously. And then within the English language publishing within the groups, they tend to work in slightly different ways. Typically, if you've got Penguin Random House or Hachette in Australia or New Zealand, you might expect that they report into someone very senior within the UK company. So for Hachette Australia, they report to the deputy CEO of Hachette UK. And then between the US and the UK, sometimes they will both report independently up to the parent company. Sometimes they will report across into each other. And so the US company might actually be answerable to the CEO of the UK company or vice versa. So it's a bit of a maze, actually. And I did often find that publishers would come to me asking for the rights to a book that I had no responsibility for. And sometimes I would have to go seeking who actually controlled the rights to that book. And so I think if any Chinese publisher were confused about where they should be going, I'd just say, just ask someone. All of these big corporations do have a map within their internal systems. And so someone should be able to point you in the right direction. It's pretty hard. As for getting 800 deals per year myself, it wasn't me on my own. I had a team of 11 people. And so we were all sort of pulling together. But that requires a lot of strategy, a lot of thought. You need to know your markets, understand your customers. You need to know your lists comprehensively. Ideally have read every book so that you can then try and work out what goes where. Which books are most suited to which markets, and within those markets, which companies would be best to publish them. So I got to the point where I was trying to devise, at least, even if it was only a very small strategy, something for every single book that we were trying to sell. And we published 1,000 books a year or more and had rights for 85% of that. So there was a huge amount of IP that we were handling, which that's how it's done. You just try and push into as many corners as you can of the global market, which I think is a little easier to achieve for children's books perhaps than for adults.
Actually, when we're recording this, I've actually asked for some of the Chinese publishers if they have any particular questions. And one publisher is called Mortier, which is one of the very strong independent Chinese publisher. And they said, what kind of advice can you give to Chinese publishers when they prepare their pitch to international publishers? And then they did ask, and this also relevant to CITIC, for example. They said, what made you want to invest from the initial interest to lead to the final decision?
Those are great questions. I think the first thing is to understand the China, from what we've seen, I think is recognized as leading the way in a lot of the transition with digital, just because a lot of digital things have happened so completely and so fast in China, whether it's electronic payments, online selling, all the things that are going on now with live events to sell, key opinion leaders and so on, KOLs. And these things are, while they're happening in the West, haven't been anything like the huge sale days, 11/11 and so on, in China. And so you're seeing a transition between the market power, I think, of the different different channels. And that's a first decision I think is important to make. Do you want to work with a major publisher, or do you want to try and use more and leverage more some of the channels that exist today that are electronic, similar to what is being done, whether it's Amazon or some other solution, and whether you want to do electronic books or fulfillment over, through things like Amazon, and whether you want to do audiobooks, which are becoming very powerful in the West as well as in China. They're all different options, and they require different mixes in strategy and how you want to attack them. That's your first starting point. I don't know what you would say, Andy, to all that.
No, I think a lot of what you've said is pertinent and correct. Certainly, in terms of making purchasing decisions online, China is definitely ahead of where we are in the UK. Actually, UK consumers do buy a lot online, more so than most other countries in the West. But it's not quite as easy. It tends not to happen via social media. There's not that sort of immediacy to making a decision. If you're watching a video and you think, hey, this is great, I'm going to go and download the film and go and buy the books, and you can just do it all through QR codes there and then. That's not how we're set up in the UK. It's much more old school, and you might click through to a link from something online that takes you to an online store, but that's about as sophisticated as things are currently. So there is a lack of immediacy, I would say, for sure. Things are still much more driven by bricks and mortar, so going into a shop and seeing something there that you like. The mechanisms are quite different, I would say. Alicia, the question was about how to present, and also how do we in the West tend to make acquisition decisions about books?
Yeah, that's right. I think if they get a chance, because in the way that, like, as right seller, that you've been doing this, like you were saying, for the past 20 years, it's a very mature industry, where for China it's still relatively new. The rights team in China, the potential equivalent that you are meeting, they're actually assisting the editorial decision. They almost like working as a scout. They look at interesting books, then they submit to the editors to look at whether there's possibility to publish in China. But actually, like you were mentioning, all the different corporate structures, it actually works slightly differently in the West.
Yeah, it's very different. Typically for the UK and the US and Western European publishers generally, a rights team will be purely selling. They have no remit for scouting or making any kind of editorial decisions. Yeah. And so if people from China are looking to sell rights and place their books, their authors' work with companies in the West, they need to be speaking to somebody else, not the rights team. Mostly it'll be someone in the editorial team, possibly a managing director or CEO, someone at a very senior level. Those are the decision makers. rights people occasionally, like we did get asked just to give tips if we saw something that was interesting, but it wasn't a remit to actually go out and search. It was just if you notice something when you're out traveling the world, let us know. That's as much as it was. I think if you've got a rights person from the UK and a rights person from China, and they're both trying to sell to each other, that's going to be quite a frustrating conversation for everyone, because that's not what the UK person is charged with doing. They have a responsibility to make a budget that's based on selling. And so you might need to have two meetings. And so maybe you're having a sort of preparatory warm-up meeting where you're discussing things with the publisher as well as the rights person, or maybe just the publisher. And then really getting an understanding of how the two houses work and what the lists are about. But then when you go on to meet the rights person, they are going to be wanting to sell. The acquisitions processes vary quite widely, I think, across different companies, even within the UK and certainly around the world. But they can be very lengthy, quite laborious. It can take months sometimes to get a decision. Other times it might be very quick, but very rarely will it ever happen during a meeting or immediately after a meeting. It will take weeks, and people need to go away, have discussions, and of course they need to get their marketing and salespeople on board, which is a very difficult thing at the moment in the UK, I think. And we're notoriously bad at buying in books for translation from anywhere in the world. It's not just China. We buy in a lot from the US, but there's no translation. You may do a little bit of editing on spelling and punctuation and certain terminology, or you may just leave it, because many UK readers, we all watch US television. We know what US English is like. I think when meeting with people from other parts of Europe, maybe Greece, Eastern Europe, and you're meeting a rights person, you may well find that they are both buying and selling. And so those conversations, but just ask. If you're not sure, ask.
I think that's an interesting point, Andy, which is, the experience Jan and I have had, which is that things in the West, organizationally, for corporates and organizations, is that things take quite a while. They are more focused on the product, but they also take quite a while to get a decision. It goes up the ladder, down the ladder, sideways through the organization. It's not even always clear what the organization is or how it functions. One of the things we found striking in China was we actually got decisions very quickly when we talked to companies. The responsibilities were devolved to a reasonably local level, the decisions. And people would come back and say, we'll be back to you in 3 or 4 days or whatever it'll be. And we'd actually get a decision back on stuff. Now, after that, it took a while for the things to push through the system, but you knew that where you were going to end up. And I think if you are Chinese, you might be coming to Western organizations, you shouldn't get discouraged, as Andy's saying, if it takes a while and you have to be patient, and they're not being evasive. That is just the way the organizations work. And they're also not as focused on building relationships. Andy was pointing out the other day to us about how people are focused on relationships, and it's true, though generally in the West people are not as focused on relationships but more on products, unlike China, where you have to have the confidence of the person that wants to work with you before they're really comfortable about doing business together. Not always, but generally relationships matter more in China. And of course that requires a respect and an understanding of the cultures and so on to be able to behave appropriately.
I thought one of the interesting phrases you came up with when we were discussing this the other day, Alan, was that in the West, it tends to be more of a transactional relationship. And my take on that is that people in the West maybe tend to build their relationships through and beyond those transactions, rather than wanting to build the relationship before the transaction, before the business is done. And I think that's a huge difference in cultures. And book fairs are maybe not the best forum for building those relationships. You need to, unless you're going to have a breakfast meeting in the morning, perhaps, and then have a half-hour buying meeting later in the day or later during the book fair. But you can't really build those relationships easily if the only times you see each other are at big international trade fairs. And that's really made me think about how to conduct business in future, because building relationships beforehand sounds like a great way of doing, but it's a huge time investment that many rights sellers don't feel they are able to give because of pressures, corporate pressures, time, resource. It's an interesting conundrum, I think, for rights sellers in the West.
But my observation, I think, is in the West, there's also people give huge credit to reputations. So, kind of, I remember, Jen, we talk about like in China, there is this rise of social media, key influencers. But I think in the West, there's certain traditional media or even, brick and mortar bookstores reviews and the kind of, I guess, literary reviews and teachers' recommendations. So those kind of things actually holds a lot more credibility. So in a way that, you were saying you want to work with reputable Chinese publishers. So those reputation needs to build in the, in the English context, in the Western context, taking time to know actually what they have published, what kind of stories, what success they've had. I guess it takes time that, in a way, one key advice is for Chinese kind of who are looking to export their stories internationally is never take no for an answer, right? You need to keep trying and keep explaining to people what I think one advantage of Chinese rights buyer is, they're able to read English, they're able to read French and Spanish. So they can see what the press review is about. Where for most publishers or editors in the West, they don't read, they're unable to read or speak Chinese, so they would rely on other resources to tell them what is this publishing group and what's their reputation built on and etc. So I guess one of the key advice is for Chinese publishers to, even though working with West, the product is really important to have that transactional process, work in progress. But it's also really important to build, to have that vision that you aim to build this long-term brand reputation of who you are internationally. I think that's also quite important. That kind of leads to, I guess, a question I have for all of you is the multimedia elements. I guess even before the whole coronavirus, people started looking at all the audiobooks, all the multimedia touch points. So people realized the way to engage with content internationally is no longer just a paper format selling. And would you kind of, what do you, both think in terms of working for Chinese publishers, maybe working with international producers to co-produce certain kind of audiobooks and enhanced ebooks and video books, both, Jan, like you said, for the Chinese market, also possibility for international markets?
One of the big culture gaps, again, as we go talking about East and West, is the West perception of China. China is dynamic. China moves fast. China's very, very modern and very proud of it. And for many people in the West, China is still the old China. It's surprising to see how often when you ask an illustrator to illustrate a Chinese story, that they come back with a drawing of somebody in long flowing robes and very often with a queue. And you think, where did they get this? I mean, they look as though, again, they've stepped out of the Qing dynasty. And they don't see China as the very modern, very exciting country that it is. You're talking about Shanghai being East meets West, and it still very much is. I mean, you can go to parts of Shanghai which are so modern, they've only been built in the last 10, 15 years. And then you can go to another part of Shanghai where you're back in in 19th century France, with beautiful buildings that are very, very French, and with plaques on them saying that various famous Chinese people lived here. It's fascinating. It's a completely cross-cultural city. And the West doesn't seem to be really across how modern China is, how fabulous the train system is, how superb the underground system is. These
generally
things,
how much
just generally how, yes, the infrastructure of China really, really works. And if you're a Western, the very first thing you do is you get a WeChat account, and we check our WeChat every single morning. Even here in France,
and
or wherever, and all day long, wherever we happen to be. These things are hugely different. And so with that, there comes something else that I think the Chinese business person has to deal with when they face a Western publisher. And that is, speaking carefully as one may, is the arrogance of the West. The West thinking that it's been doing this for a very long time, and China's fairly new, and that basically the West knows it all. And of course it doesn't, because as you were saying, China with social media, China with digital learning, China with this kids are so across screens and so comfortable with high tech. Which still in places in the West, especially in England, people say, oh let my grandchild do it. He knows it more than I do. But there's a very strong reluctance to actually learn. So this is something that is difficult, I think, for China facing the West. And it's interesting to me that the big Chinese dramas, for example, are now, many of them on Netflix. People in the West, again, still looking to the old China and enjoying it immensely, but not really seeing modern, vibrant China. So there is that disconnect, if you like, in the way that the perception of the East and the West, and the way the West looks at the East, and the way the East looks at the West.
Yes, yeah, very much so. I think.
Just go on. A very interesting little anecdote. That referring to what you were saying earlier, when COVID came, and we were in China when COVID arrived, and things started closing down, and then we came back to the West as we had to. The difference of culture, the people we had met and become friends with in China through our work and our activities, we had so many of them contact us to check how we were doing as things got problematic in Europe. And do you need anything? Can we send you masks? Can we provide you with anything from China? Let us know if you need anything. And this was not once, it was not twice, it was many different people. Mm-hmm. And there was a warmth and a generosity. And that comes from that relationship that people build up with you, and that mutual confidence that is so important later to keep relationships. Call it guanqi or call it whatever you want, but it is important. And rightly so, I think. And it was very, very revealing to us. But on to your question about multimedia and audiobooks and so on. It's kind of interesting to us that all of storytelling started with the spoken word, people telling stories to one another, to their children, one generation after the other. And there's this great storytelling traditions. And then you got writing, and people wrote books and so on. And then we got movies, and now we're coming back, strangely enough, to audiobooks. And the growth of audiobooks in China has been phenomenal, and in the West as well, particularly in America. And today, I think 2/3 of all the audiobooks sold are actually sold between China and America. And the growth every year is taking more and more, getting more and more traction. Same along with podcasts. They're kind of the same thing in many ways. And in fact, they're even eating into sales, at least in America, of ebooks. So you say, apparently. And so you say, wow, clearly people enjoy the experience. They can see the images if stuff is well read and well produced in audiobooks. And those books come alive as they did when they were hearing the stories told by wonderful storytellers. And I think that's where the opportunity really lies because books create a world. No, maybe not a technical book about mathematics or engineering, but most storybooks and fiction do. And with the right reader and the right preparation of the soundtracks, both for the video books and the audio books, you can work absolute magic. And you can bring over much more the feel and the goals of the original story, the original author, the original illustrator. That is the direction that we have felt is the opportunity and the place where we could bring the most to our readers and the best understanding. So I hope that kind of addresses your question. I don't know, Jan, do you have anything to add to that?
Only one small thing. Many years ago, I was amazed by a little anecdote that I heard. It's a very much an inside the BBC story. But there was, we used to have years ago a program called Letterbox, in which people could write and say what they thought. Today there's one called Feedback. It's the same sort of thing. And there was a marvelous story about a lady who had been in England and she'd seen Jane Eyre on the television and she'd loved it. Then she'd gone home to Zimbabwe and she'd been listening to the BBC World Service. And she wrote to say that she enjoyed it so much more when she heard Jane Eyre on the radio because the costumes were prettier. And that to me is the power of the spoken word. She saw in her mind what she imagined was something beautiful. And when somebody was wearing something beautiful, or when Jane Eyre, when there was a fire at the Rochester house, her fire was very different from the one that was seen on television, but that was because it was her fire. And your fire would be different, as would Alan's, as would mine. And that to me is what the challenge is when you're telling a story, and you're telling a story to somebody and they're listening to you, is to make it so that they can see that story. They can see the panda hiding. They can see the monster under the bed or the elf in the sock drawer, but they're there. They're really there and they can see it and they can tell you about it.
Great. I hope we'll be able to show a short clip of some of the video book that you did, because I really enjoyed it. You know, I played it for my son and he loved it.
First the bang, bang, bang from the drums. Then the endless blasts from the trumpets. "Somebody's daughter is getting married," he said to Mummy Mouse. "I'm not the most powerful in all the world," said the sun. "When a cloud passes in front of me, nobody knows I'm there. You should talk to the cloud." "So," said Daddy Mouse, "the sun is afraid of the cloud. The cloud is afraid of the wind. The wind is afraid of the wall. And the wall is afraid of the mice. And we are the mice."
That kind of, I guess, brings it to something that we're facing, really, the challenge to collaboration over the next 6 to 12 months is because of, the world is no longer that easy to travel and navigate with the whole coronavirus. But in a strange way, we're all very connected digitally. Like 3 of us, kind of 4 of us today, we're actually all based in totally different part of the world. And children, I think their personal experience also transformed in the past couple of months where, I've seen my 2-year-old son in London would pick up my phone and put it on a selfie stick and spit it out to the grandparents in Beijing to read him a picture book via screen. He understood it perfectly. And how do you see this kind of connectivity that adding to the, professionally within publishing that you can communicate with or the counterpart in China and vice versa? Because I know the Beijing International Book Fair, unfortunately, we're unable to travel to Beijing this summer, but they will have a special online edition where, all the Chinese publishers will upload their catalog and some of their highlights. And so for potential rights buyers in the West, and also rights sellers, kind of they can meet up and hopefully have this kind of video conversation as well. And Andy, what do you think in terms of, is there any good tips for Chinese publishers to present themselves if they get this chance of potentially meeting international publishers?
Yeah, I think we will just have to do what we can when we can't actually be together, because I think nothing replaces in-person meetings where you're actually sharing books, whether in print or on screen, and talking about them together. So, I mean, to me, the idea of uploading a catalogue and not being able to discuss that is the opposite of what I think people should be doing. If they can do that alongside a video call and they can actually talk through that catalogue whilst looking at it, that's fine. But if you're just going to upload a complete catalogue and expect your customers to be able to navigate that and understand the nuance of what they're looking at and what actually suits them, their list, and what they're trying to achieve in their own publishing, then I think you're onto a bit of a loser with that. It's got to be accompanied by as close an approximation as you can make to in-person conversation as you can get. And even a video call is not really perfect. I think this conversation would be easier if we were all in the same room. It's just that human contact can't quite be replaced. But I do think a video alongside a PDF of a catalogue would be a good approximation. Yeah.
Yes.
In terms of presenting yourself, I do think you mentioned highlights, and I think that's absolutely the way to go. Make it very clear what you think the best books for the global market might be, and elevate them. Put them at the front, or give them some kind of special signification inside the catalogue, so that it's very clear. And in terms of how to present each title, I think as concisely as you can and as clearly as you can. Ideally, everything on no more than one page. That would include all of the pertinent information, as much of the story as you can get on in one side of A4. I know that's not easy, and give people some sense of the characters, the setting, the plotting, the beginning, the middle, and the end, if your story has one, and which from the West certainly stories do, as well as some information about maybe where you have already sold it, and why your readers love it. If you can get a reader review and put that on there, just a couple of lines, a quote, that's very useful. But it's hard just to give someone a whole catalogue and expect them to deal with that. I think it's too much.
Yeah.
You've got to hone it.
Yes, I know you have done a few, as a good right seller, a few do's and don'ts. Then I think we can definitely later share it on screen as well.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of nuance to the whole process of right selling, and it's quite hard to boil it down to a few don'ts and do's. So I'm sure there will be some very obvious things that I've omitted here, but start with the don'ts. As I said before, don't send a complete catalogue, or even worse, mail someone a box of books and expect them to know what they're doing. They can't navigate that. They need your guidance to help them through it. If you can't be with someone, whether in person or by video, then maybe send an email and list your highlight title or your best three. And if you're emailing different markets, think about that, because what the three best titles for the UK will not be the same as the three best titles for France, or the three best titles for America or Peru or wherever. As Jan said earlier, the West is not one amorphous mass. It's very different. And in rights selling, even from the UK, you can't automatically assume that books will be suitable for the US just because they work in the UK. There's countless examples of books that don't cross the Atlantic. Even with our near neighbours in the UK, in France and the Netherlands and Scandinavia, it's not always that obvious that just because it works here, it's going to work next door. That's really not the case. So try and hone each pitch to each country because they're going to be different. Back to the don'ts. Don't sit in a meeting and try and tell the story of every book. You will have very limited time at a book fair. Of course, if the customer asks you and says they want to know the story of every book you present, then you've probably only got time for 2 or 3. So pick those 2 or 3 very wisely, which will come back to a point of do's of preparation that I'll get to in a minute. In the longer term, don't take rejection badly. You always get rejections before you get acceptance, before you get offers. And as a rights person selling, you have to be very thick-skinned about that. Just take it on the chin. You get loads of rejections. You get more no's than yeses, but it's the yeses that really count. And that's what you get out of bed in the morning for. Onto some do's. Know your list. It sounds really obvious, but you'd be surprised how many rights sellers don't really understand their list. They don't know what the author's going to do next, maybe what the author has done in the past, what the publisher's plans are for developing their list in the future. And of course, you need to read. You need to read your books. If you don't know your books yourself, how can you convey the passion, the understanding of why you think this book suits the Chinese market, or indeed whatever other market you're trying to sell to? Prepare. Know your books, know your customers, know your markets, know as much as you can. It's impossible to know everything, but do think about each book, how it matches to which markets in the world. No book suits everywhere. So where does this book work? Where should it work? And within those markets, which are the best publishers for those books? I think one of the primary things to do, think about what your customer wants to buy, not what you were charged with selling. Don't be selfish in a way. I know if you're selling, you will have a target, a budget to meet. The best way to meet that is actually to think about what your customers want, not what you need to sell. You will get the sales if you're thinking about your customers. And persist. You mentioned this earlier, Alicia. Keep going, keep trying. You've got to try not to annoy your customers by always talking to them about this same project, but don't be scared of coming back to it. Just because they've said no doesn't mean that next year or in 2 years' time it's still no, because markets move on. The success of your series at home and other countries in the world may have risen in such a way that it does seem more appealing now to people overseas. And authors' profiles change as well. So just because the time wasn't right in 2020 doesn't mean that the time won't be right in 2022. Those are my key do's and don'ts.
Yeah, no, it's really useful, because I just want to kind of summarize. There's a few key points, because I think with Jen and Alan, you said earlier that a good and appropriate translation and the presentation is essential. Whether it's audio, multimedia, or picture book, or just a story itself. And then commercially, like Andy, you said you need to really understand the decision-making process, and also make sure you know the do's and don'ts, the few things we mentioned. We'll put it up on screen, I think, as well. And finally, I think is I guess, to tell a great story is really an art. It's, I guess, in a way, it's not just a science, those 1+1. And to work in the industry, we talk about the East, it's all about the relationships. But actually, I think working between East and West, there's always a long-term relationship, a reputation that you're building. So it's really important to work towards that beyond any individual, I guess, one book, a transaction deal. I think that's really we both, both East and West agree on. So I thought I will end this BIBF Insights webinar today by going back in time. I want to use a quote from David Copperfield, which is the most important thing in life is to stop saying I wish and start saying I will, and consider nothing impossible and treat possibilities as probabilities. Even though in the book itself, the David Copperfield, Charles Dickens is, they're all one of the greatest literature and writers of all time today. But actually travel back in time, it wasn't necessarily so in the 1930s, a time when the Second World War just finished. People are feeling very anxious and pessimistic about the world, a little bit like this year when people are feeling the anxious pressure. And there was an argument that say that Charles Dickens, do not hold much value, and translating them is just a lot of trouble. But my grandfather, as a translator, once said, Charles Dickens truly understands the meaning of humanity. It is not immersed in mockery or mercy. His strength lies in his soul that spreads happiness, joy, and kind thoughts. I think such a belief in the goodness of human nature is very much needed at these worrying and anxious times. And really, I think through this webinar discussion today, and we really hope by introducing the beautiful stories from China, by teaching people how to best present them, and will help more children to see themselves in the books they read and help children understand the world and their place in it. So I want to take the opportunity to thank all my speakers joining me today, and thank you for all the audience watching it in China. 谢谢 Alan, 谢谢 Jan, and 谢谢 Andy.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.